Hi, this is Jim Linnell. You know, I've been doing leatherwork for over 50 years now, and I've been teaching classes all over the place on behalf of Elk Track Studio. And of all of the classes that I've ever taught, there are none that are more important than what I'm going to show you right now. And that is, how do you get started in leatherwork? There are some basic techniques, some things that you need to learn, and if you learn those correctly, they will make a huge difference on how much enjoyment you get out of your leatherwork. So stay with me as I walk you through doing a pattern just like this, which will teach you how to use all of the most basic leatherworking tools. The first thing we need to do when we get ready to start a design is we need obviously a piece of leather to work on. The leather we work on when we're carving designs into leather is vegetable tan leather, and I have here a piece of vegetable tan leather. It's a little bit lighter than what somebody might start out with. It's about a 4 or 5 ounce. I've glued a piece of cardboard to the back of it just so that it keeps it stable here. But vegetable leather is tanned such that when we apply moisture to the surface of it, it will absorb that moisture. It kind of opens up the pores of the leather, and this then becomes what the first step in preparing this leather for carving. We have to get it cased, and that's kind of the technical term for this. We will dampen it down, and when I do this initial wetting, I try to dampen it down so that the moisture gets maybe halfway through that piece of leather. So it looks like I'm just putting a lot of water on here, but the goal here isn't to soak it all the way through, but just to make sure that it gets penetrated down into the inner fibers of this piece of leather. And then we're ready to then put an outline of the design on the piece of leather. And I've got here an outline that I drew up that gives me the basic lines that I need to have, and I've transferred that onto some vellum so that I can lay that over my pattern or over my piece of leather and kind of make sure I've got it centered and so forth. So the very first thing I'm going to do once I get it where I want it is I'm going to take a little piece of tape here and I'm going to tack it down just so that it doesn't move while I start this tracing. One of the things that you'll want to do is make sure you got good clean lines to follow and such. So just making sure once you start this you don't have it scoot around on you is kind of an important thing. And then I'm going to use a stylus to trace this design on the leather. A stylus is just a pointed object. Sometimes they'll come with a little ball on the end of them, but they're usually polished up pretty good. And the idea here is to take this tool and trace along those lines with a little bit of pressure, and that'll leave an indentation in the leather, and that's kind of what we need to get started. And when you do a design, you'll want to make sure you're real thorough that you get all of these lines traced onto the leather so that you've got everything there to follow. And so take your time with this. When you are getting started, these kinds of designs usually are what will come in an instruction book, and there are lots of good instruction books out there that have great patterns for you to follow that will show you and let you do a design that uses all of the basic leatherworking tools. So you don't have to necessarily draw one up from scratch, I guess is what I'm saying. You don't worry about that. There's designs to follow, and what you really need is this basic outline. They make a lot of other great guides to help you in the early stages. There are plastic templates that they have with the designs raised on one side of that plastic, and those the Tandy Leather sells one called Craft Aids. Maker's Leather Supply sells one called Pattern Rubs. But the basic idea with those is that they will give you an outline of the design and raised on a piece of plastic, and when you rub over that, it will imprint that same sort of an outline onto your leather, and that's where you have to start. One of the things about this design that I am doing here today is that it utilizes all of the basic stamping tools. Sometimes people will look at a leather catalog or or a supply catalog, and they will just be overwhelmed with all of the selection of tools and equipment that's available, and just you might even be scared to death at how much all of that might cost if they were to buy all of it. But I want you to first of all know that it doesn't take all of that to be able to do leatherwork. I'm going to do this design today with just 6 of those basic stamping tools. And believe it or not, if you know how to use these 6 tools, well, 7 when you count the swivel knife, but when you learn to use those tools and learn the technique of using them, you're pretty well ready to use any of those tools that you see in those leather catalogs. Leatherwork really is broken down to that basic. I can take the basic stamping tools that I'm going to carve this design with, and I can carve a saddle, I can carve projects of any size. You're not limited about how big or what kind of leatherwork you can do based on the number of tools you have. What limits you is your knowledge on how to use those tools. And so that's what this little instruction is about, is to show you those most important things that you need to know about using the basic tools, because again, once you have that down, you really are ready to do a whole lot of leatherwork. And unfortunately, in this day and age, well, not unfortunately, it's one of the great things about this day and age, but there are lots of good resources available on the internet. And the problem, though, for somebody that's first starting out is you don't know if the person that's teaching you really knows what they're doing or whether they don't. So let me tell you about me. My name's Jim Linnell, and I've been doing leatherwork for an awful long time. I started over 50 years ago doing a design very similar to this right here, learning how to use those basic tools. And then I have had the privilege of just working at it for all of those years. And leatherwork hasn't changed over those years. Those things that I learned in that very first class are still some of those basic techniques that need to be learned. And so that's what I'm going to share with you today, is the things I think are the most important for you to know. One of the things about a lot of the designs that we do in leatherwork, some of it's very classic. We use leaves and petals and things like that that have been used in design work for centuries. It's very classic, the leaves and petals and stuff like that. So we're not really creating something new and different here. We're just keeping a very old tradition alive. Leatherwork like you're going to see done here has been done in this country since the Spaniards arrived here. So I'm just passing that forward. So when you think that you're all done, you think you've got all of these lines traced, the very first thing you want to do is check and make sure. I've got this taped down on the corners, and so I can pick up my tracing material, and I can look and see if I've missed anything, and if I have, I can lay it back down and go back and catch those. But looks like I've got all of those lines traced on there, so let's go ahead and pull that paper away, and we'll get ready to begin cutting this design into the leather. And that's one of the next things that we do to make this design stand out. So this here, I'm going to introduce you to this next tool. It's called the swivel knife, and it's probably going to be one of the more challenging of the tools for you to learn to use. But the first thing you have to do is make sure that it's working properly. So here's the trick to that. We need to strop it. You've heard of a razor strop. Some of us heard about razor strops the wrong way, but a razor strop was something that they used, barbers used, to keep the edges of their knives very polished, very sharp, so that they would cut cleanly and smoothly. And so I'm making something similar to that. I've just got a piece of cardboard here, and I'm using jeweler's rouge right now and rubbing it into that cardboard. Jeweler's rouge, well, it's the same stuff that a jeweler would use if they were going to polish rings and things like that. And that's exactly what it does here to my swivel knife blade. what I'm doing is I'm polishing it. And you can see that dark color that's coming up on this piece of cardboard now. That's actually metal coming off of this blade. It's putting a very fine polished finish on that blade, and it makes such a huge difference in how easy it is to control this knife. So this is one of the first things you want to do before you start cutting into your leather. Make sure that this tool is ready to do that cutting. And then the next thing, after you've got it ready to go, you got to figure out then how to hold it. I mean, it doesn't look like any kind of a knife you probably have ever used before. When I tell folks when they're first starting out how to hold it, I said just lay it on your granite like that, and then just pick it up. And that's pretty close to the way you're going to hold this tool when you're working with it. I'm going to hold it so that my forefinger here is resting in the yoke up to about the first knuckle. My thumb rests on one side, my middle finger is opposite that, and then I actually have my ring finger here resting against the side of the blade. And then this whole rest of my hand, it will kind of rest on the granite or on the table. And then I make the cuts by angling the knife away from me just a little bit so that just the corner of the blade is in the leather. And then by pulling it toward me, I will make cuts in the leather. And I make these nice curving cuts because this part up here rotates. That's where it gets its name, swivel knife. And the trick to getting these cuts to come out nice and smooth with nice fluid corners and so forth is to learn to rotate that knife as you pull it towards you. Sometimes I'll see beginners struggle with this part. They will want to turn their leather, or they'll be moving their whole arm or elbow or their wrist and everything, trying to make that knife go around a curving line. And it's really a fingertip controlled tool. We just make it go around those curves by just rotating it between our fingers. And I keep it always coming toward me, so when I get to an angle where I cannot see where that blade is going to go, I'll stop and I'll turn the leather so I can see what I'm doing, and I'll continue then cutting. But we always want to be able to see what we're doing. We are actually cutting into the leather, so a mistake here now is going to be really hard to cover up. It's going to be really hard to disguise. So make sure that you're doing it very carefully. One of the things I would have you notice is how slow and deliberate I am with this. This is not something that you try to do as fast as you can. When I first started out, one of the guys that I got a chance to watch do some leather work, oh, he was good. I mean, he'd been doing leather work for, 40 some years by that time. And when he used this tool, it was quick. Well, he was in the business of doing leather work for a living, and he had to get stuff done in a hurry, and so he was quick. Man, he could run this knife. He'd have this cut in just nothing flat. It wasn't always really super pretty, but it was done, and it was done pretty well. And one of the things, though, I learned when I tried to do it fast like that, I learned that the secret of controlling this knife wasn't to run it fast. The secret, for me anyway, was to slow down, make sure I know how to make it run. Yes, I can cut a lot faster than this, but speed comes from learning how to use these tools correctly. When you're first starting out, don't worry so much about how long this is going to take or how long it's going to require for you to work on this project. What I want you to focus on is how to use these tools correctly. As you get comfortable with using the tools, as you get comfortable making them do what they're intended to do, you'll find that your speed will pick up. You'll develop a rhythm on using these tools to where you're not having to consciously think about, okay, I got to hold this tool just right and so forth. But the using this knife, getting these fluid cuts, I hope as you're looking at this, it looks really easy. But I want to remind you again that I've been doing leather work for over 50 years. Probably what I'm doing right now should look easy. If I've got it figured out at all, it probably ought to look pretty easy when I'm doing it. But some of the things I struggled with was just being able to make good, clean cuts and make it follow the line. And that's, I think, the things that you'll be working with when you're using this knife too. So one of the things to keep in mind is, again, this grip. This grip is so important. Sometimes I'll see folks, they'll they'll get this finger wrapped clear around it like this, and next thing you know, they're trying to make a fist around their knife. And when you put a fist around your knife, you lose a lot of that control. And I will sometimes will see people using this knife, and they'll get they'll stop every once in a while and they'll shake their hand out like this, and you know, that tells me that they probably are getting cramps or something in their hand. And if you're doing that, you probably have your whole hand tensed up when you're doing this, rather than letting the tool do its job. This thing's called a swivel knife, and the way you hold it is really important. We have one finger here, the forefinger. This is the only finger that does anything as far as applying pressure. All of the rest of these fingers should be relaxed. They're just simply guiding the knife along as you're making the cuts. The only part of my hand that's got any kind of pressure on it is the forefinger there, and it's doing all the pushing down to make sure I get enough depth. And that becomes one of the next questions you get to ask is, how deep should I be cutting right now? How deep should these lines be cut into the leather? And a good general rule when you're first starting out is to cut roughly about 1/3 to maybe at the most 1/2 the thickness of your leather. So when you're cutting on some thinner leather like I am here, that means you're probably not cutting as deep as you would as if you had some saddle skirting or something as heavy as that. One of the things that I often get asked by folks that in the classes that I teach is they'll see me using the swivel knife that I'm using. They'll want to know, is that the kind of blade I should have? Is that the kind of knife I should be using? And things like that. And the thing that I would want you to know, I'll say this probably more than once before I'm done, but the thing that's important here is not what tool you have, but your knowledge of how to use that tool. When it, for example, the swivel knife blade that I'm using here, it's a 1/4 inch straight blade. And you want to know why I use a 1/4 inch straight blade? It's because that's what I've been using for probably 40 of those 50 years. And that's what's comfortable for me. The one that you should use is the one that works best for you. You probably, if you're just getting started, you probably have a straight blade that probably is maybe got a 3/8 inch wide blade in it. That blade will do everything that I'm doing right now. The key is not in the blade, but it's again in having it polished up, having it sharpened up so that it works smoothly, and then you learning how to control it. The magic isn't in the knife. The magic, or the important stuff, is in the knowledge of the hand that you're running it. When you're using these tools, it's how much practice you're willing to put into it is what's going to determine how well any of them work. So I want to make sure that's clear right off. When I got started in leatherwork, I started out with whatever the cheapest tools I could buy at the time were. They were just a basic set of tools, and it had whatever basic swivel knife came with it, and I still have those tools. I still use them. In fact, I may be using some of them on this pet project here. But those basic tools haven't changed, and they still work just fine. One of the things too, as you're cutting this design into the leather, one of the things I would point out to you is that there are some dotted lines. If you, as you were tracing this design into the leather, as I was tracing it in, you'll notice there's a little half circle in the middle of that flower that was put in with dotted lines. And as I'm cutting this design into the leather, those dotted lines are not cut. Everything else that I traced on here, except for the dotted lines, gets cut into the leather. And that is those are there for a guide for me to know where to put the seeds when we get around to doing that part of the design. So all the rest of these get cut in. So one of the couple little things, again, little stuff that will help you improve your leatherwork along the way is a lot of times as you're making these cuts, for example, you'll have cuts like these little Y-shaped cuts where you have two lines that look like they come together, but if you were to look really closely here, you'll notice that my swivel knife doesn't actually run all the way into the other cut. Out here on these tips where I have a pointed corner like that, they come very close together, but they don't actually, one cut doesn't run into the other. And that's one of the things I would have you be kind of careful about. Sometimes if you cut past the line, thinking that you're just going to cut down into that cut, you'll leave a little nick in the leather, and sometimes those kind of things just don't ever go away. So there we have that design cut into the leather, and while it might look like this leather has dried out quite a bit, I can tell you that right now it's almost perfect to be working. You can see here a little bit of change in the color here where it still looks kind of damp, but I don't actually go by the color of the leather to determine whether it has the right moisture content in it. What I go by is how the tools react and you know how it feels. I can feel it with the back of my hand, and it still feels kind of damp to the touch, and kind of cool to the touch. But ultimately, it comes down to how these tools are going to work. And so we're now ready to stamp this design into the leather, and we'll begin with the camouflage tool. We're about to begin our stamping, and I'd like to show you first of all, the tools that we're going to use. These 6 tools right here represent all of the basic stamping tools that are used in most leather carving. And if you learn how to use each of these 6 tools correctly and the techniques that each one of these require, you're going to be well on your way to learning to do leather work. And so that's what I'm going to show you. The first tool that I'm going to use is called the camouflage, and I'll tell you right off that the sequence that I'm going to use these tools in is kind of, well, it's historic. It's the way I was taught. It's the way a lot of the great leather workers like Al Stolman taught it, and it's just a good way to get through it. And there's some reasons why these need to be used in this sequence. So the camouflage tool, where do we use that? The camouflage tool, first of all, is a shell-shaped tool. It's kind of looks like a big eyelash. It's got a bunch of lines that radiate out from a half circle. And when we use this tool, sometimes we'll use it mostly straight up and down so that we get almost a full impression, where we can see almost the full width of the tool. But like here in the flower petals, what I'm doing is I'm creating some texture in the middle of these flower petals, and so I started out with a bit more force right there on that dotted line that I used to show me where the seeds are going to go. And then I got lighter and lighter and lighter as I went up each one of those. So there I used almost a full impression. And I'll do the same thing. We've got a couple of petals down here. We'll go ahead and do the same thing in those petals as well. Put that texture running away from there. One of the other places that we use it, or a couple of other places that we use this, is we use it on the scroll. This little curlicue that you see right here, this is a scroll. This is one of the basic design elements in a lot of Western floral carving, and it comes to a very tight turn right here, and I have this camouflage tool that I have kind of matches it. It doesn't match it exactly, but by tipping it up so that just the corner of it gets a really deep impression, I really kind of pronounce where the end of that scroll comes to its tightest part there. And so that's one of the places we use it. We also use it here in the middle of this leaf. Right here, I was talking about some of those classic design elements. This right here, this leaf right here is called an acanthus leaf, and it's one that you'll see again in a lot of leatherwork. And one of the characteristics, it'll usually have this big broad petal in the middle, and then it'll have a leaf off of each side of that petal. And then in this broad petal, there's often a line that runs right up the middle of it. It's kind of like a crease running up the middle of that leaf. And we give that some roundness by using this camouflage tool. We'll use this on the inside of that curve, and this is kind of a general rule, I guess. When we use this camouflage tool around on an acanthus leaf, we will usually use it on the inside curve, okay? But one of the things you'll see me doing here is I have this tool angled at quite a bit so that I'm only getting a partial impression. The impression is quite deep here on the corners, right there in that cut. In fact, I put the corner of this tool right in that cut. And then I have it angled though so that that impression fades out before it gets maybe a third of the way across the width of that tool. And the end result of that is that it looks like this leather now rolls over like this down into that center cut that runs there. So that's one of the other places that we use the camouflage tool. We also use it sometimes on the stem of a flower. This flower right here has a stem running up, holding it up, and we'll usually put some kind of a texture on that. So when I do that, again, I have to use just the corner of the tool to make impressions that don't cover up more than I want them to. And the thing, I guess, that makes this camouflage work look really good is being consistent in the spacing. You want to have them the same distance apart all the way up the length of a stem, or like all the way up the middle of that acanthus leaf. The spacing between each one of these impressions is kind of what makes these look right. So, and here I'm putting a little part of an impression on the other side, so it almost looks like I had a small camouflage tool that reached all the way across this stem, leaving this kind of a a wavy texture running up the stem. So that's one of the other places that the camouflage tool gets used. And that's the camouflage tool. That's what it does. It adds roundness, it adds texture, like in the flower petals here, but it adds roundness where we use it on the leaves, like on this acanthus leaf, and that's what it does. We do use it, we'll go ahead and put some around the outside of this this part of the design that turns into the scroll. We'll help to give this outside edge kind of that same rounded effect by running some corner impressions along it as well. One of the things I hope you're seeing is that where I'm using this tool, you notice how it's turning a nice rich color in here, and you'll see that more with this next step, but this is called burnish, and that's what helps you to get good contrast in your design. In fact, this next tool that we use is called the pear shader, and I'll just use it here just to show you what burnish really looks like. We'll be using this in the petals and to create kind of a 3D effect, but you see how that turns a nice rich brown? Well, that color is something that you want to get out of your leatherworking, and then that color is caused by having just the right moisture content in your leather. This leather, again, it might look like it's almost dried out. It's almost back to its original color. You can still maybe see a little discoloration there. But what causes this burnish is not whether it looks wet or doesn't, but it's how much moisture is in the inner fibers. Remember when we first wet this down, we wet it down so that the moisture got down into the middle fiber. We wet it pretty well. Now, while it may be drying out on the surface, it's still got that moisture down in there. And so as we compress the fibers of the leather, we bring that burnish, that color to the surface. So that's why I'm saying we kind of let the tools tell us whether we got the right moisture content in there or not. So what's the pear shader? The pear shader, well, it gets its name if you look at the tool, look at the end of the tool, it's kind of a pear-shaped tool. And so that's where it gets its name, and I guess it also gets its name by what it does. You can see that it does indeed shade in the leather. But what's the whole idea here? We got a flower petal, and you know, it had some texture on it from the camouflage tool, but it was very flat still looking. But by using this pear shader tool, I've created a ripple in it. I've created a little bit of a dished area on either side of that, and so I've got some 3 dimensions starting to happen with this camouflage, or with this pear shader, and that's the whole point of it. And the technique, I think this again is one of those tools that beginners can struggle with quite a bit. And there's the technique of this, being able to walk it along and make it come out nice and smooth like this, that comes as a result of learning how to hold this tool and use it. And so I'm going to kind of exaggerate this just a little bit, but the way that you hold this tool is what makes it work. And by that, if you look at the grip I have on this tool, I'm holding it so that obviously my thumb's up from the bottom, but I've got, then just opposite that, I've got my other 3 fingers there with my ring finger down here, actually right against the face of the tool. And when I'm using this tool, I even let my little finger and that other one, ring finger, kind of rest right on the leather. That gives me good control over that tool so that I know it makes an impression exactly where I want it to. And then, but I have a fairly tight grip. So when I hit this tool, and I'll exaggerate this just a little bit so that you can kind of see what I'm doing, but when I hold this tool, because of the tight grip I have, you see how it bounces back off the leather? Now I'm not holding it off the leather like that. When I'm holding it so that it just barely touches the leather. But when I whack it, it bounces back up. It's not sitting in a hole in the leather. And then as I move it along, I'm overlapping those impressions so that when I get done shading an area like this, you don't see every mark every time I whacked it. What you see is a kind of a dished out area that gives that petal that 3-dimensional contour. So this takes a little practice. This is one of those techniques that if you can learn this now when you're first getting started in leatherwork, I promise you it's going to really make this shading come out. And you're going to find that this is a tool that you use a lot in just about every floral type carving. Sometimes you have long, narrow, skinny places you have to use this tool. Sometimes you have big, broad areas like these petals here where you have, so you need to sometimes learn how to overlap it and move it sideways to fill in an area. But one of the other things I hope you can see is that as I move the shading away from the edges of the flower, I'm hitting it pretty firmly out here at the edge of the flower, but then as I move this tool toward the seeds, as I kind of move down the length of that petal toward where those seeds are going to be, I lighten up on the force of that tool so that it fades out and disappears. You can see very distinctly where I started up there. I even keep a pretty even distance away from that line that was cut. But then as I come down toward the middle of this flower, I lighten up on those the force of the mallet so that it gets lighter and lighter and lighter. And you never actually see where I actually ended. You can see where I started up there. That's pretty bold and pretty vivid. But as you come down the length of it, you don't actually see where I finally made that last whack. You want that to just fade out and disappear. And this is all about getting flow and contour to your leather. You can see how all of this now kind of all is pointing and blending toward the center of that flower. We have several leaves here, and this is the other thing. This is a flower, and it kind of helps to understand what you're making here, and that'll become really important when we start doing the beveling. But the understanding what this is that we're creating is we have a flower here, and it has, if you look at it, it has 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 petals on it. These 2 petals here are kind of leaning toward you. They're kind of coming straight at you. These here are laying back a little bit so you can see kind of the full size of them. And then you've got these seeds down in the middle in this little pocket in the center of that. Well, that's what we want to make this look like by the use of these tools. So I created some contour and some shape to these leaves. I have all of this flow. Everything's kind of looks like it's headed toward the middle of that. And that helps a lot in understanding what these tools should be doing. What's the effect that I should be creating with these tools when I use them? So it takes take a minute and kind of study the design. This design here, when I get all done with this, we will make sure that this is provided along with us. We have at Elk Track Studio, if you've visited our website, we've got some videos that go into great detail about every one of these stamping steps. If what you're getting here is a real good brief introduction to what leatherworking is and what the tools are and how they're used. But if we have, you know, 2-hour video on just how to use a beveler and one on just running the swivel knife and so forth, because if you really get involved with this and really want to learn how to do all of these things right, we want to make sure those resources are available for you. So that's at uptrackstudio.com. So, but also, yeah, the reason I mentioned that is that that's where this pattern will be. If you're watching this video and you'd like to do this same pattern that I'm doing, it's going to be available along with kind of a step-by-step guide for you to follow as far as the sequence, the number, you know, which tools I used and where I used them and so forth. That'll be there, and it's free for you to download. So just go check it out. There's in fact a whole section there of free patterns that you're welcome to give a try, and there's probably a video associated with many of them if you want some help on how to do any one of those too. So anyway, so the pear shading is we're doing it. What we're doing is we're not just putting dents in the leather. We are actually sculpturing the leather. We're taking these flat, smooth flower petals and we're adding 3-dimension to them. We're giving them contour and flow and starting to add some color, in fact, to our leather. We're starting to give it some rich burnish, and you know, all of this is the stuff that we want to bring out. There's a whole bunch of different products that are available as far as dyes and finishes and antiques and things like that, and yeah, there's videos on how to use all that stuff too. But if you learn how to control your moisture content, if you learn how to use these tools correctly, you're going to be amazed at how much natural color is right here in your leather. And if you do this right, in fact, the old leather workers, they never put all that goofy stuff on there. Well, that's not goofy stuff, but they never put all of those different kinds of things on their leather to try to make their design look rich. They were masters at this. They knew how to use their tools and control the moisture and so forth to make these rich colors, this rich natural burnish come out of a piece of leather. And believe it or not, if you can do that, you're going to find that this stuff even gets neater the older it gets. As it's exposed to sunlight and to the weather and so forth, that's why some of these old saddles and such that you see, they just look so rich and they have so much character. And a lot of that is just time. And of course the masters brought out the designs, but the rest of that is just the aging, natural aging of the leather. And it's if you learn how to do this right, you can really create some beautiful work. There are people today that have taken leatherwork far beyond just building belts and saddles and things like that. I mean, they've turned this into an art form. There are some pieces of or some artists out there that are using leatherwork as their medium and just doing some fantastic work. But you know what? Every one of those, when you go look at some of those fantastic pieces of leather, you know what? Every one of those people started right here where you are right now. The very first and very most important thing you have to learn is the basic techniques of the most important tools in there. Where you go with this is entirely up to you, but you kind of got to have a framework. You kind of got to have a foundation underneath you of how to use those basic tools. And then you can apply it to any kind of a design, any kind of a piece of leatherwork that you want to do. That part is all up to you. That's why this is such an important lesson that you're getting right now. Let's see, we got just a couple more places here we need to use the pear shader. One of the things I should tell you too about this pear shader and camouflage, all these tools that I'm using, when you look, I think I mentioned this, is when you look at any of the catalogs where these things are sold, you're going to see just lots of variations. Well, like on the pear shaders, they make these in a lot of different textures. The one that I'm using has got some vertical lines on it. They make them with horizontal lines and checkering, and they make them smooth and and they all of those have their purpose and do different things, or produce a little different result. But one of the things I want you to know, and this is really important, that this rich color, this burnishing that you see me getting out of this piece of leather is not because of the texture on the tool, it's because of the moisture content in the leather. It's that important to control that. So the tool, the leather's still giving me that nice rich color, so it's still in good shape, but that doesn't mean that I won't have to wet it again. I'm sure I'll have to add more moisture to this piece of leather before I actually finish. So we'll, but again, we're going to let the tools tell me when I need to do that. So, all right, we've been through two of the stamping tools so far. The next one that we use, well, this one might actually be the most important of all of your stamping tools. This one's called the beveler, and I guess I should show you again what that looks like. The beveler is kind of a wedge-shaped tool. It's got one corner here that's longer than the others, and it's kind of beveled off. Of course, that's where it gets its name. And when you're using this tool, we use this long corner of it. The toe of it is what that's called. We use the toe of it, and we put that right into those cuts that we initially cut into the leather, and by tapping it and moving it along, we press down the leather on one side, and this is how we make a flower or whatever our design is. This is how we make it stand out on that piece of leather, by kind of tapping it down. If any of you come from a woodworking background, when you ever watch a woodworker carve woods, that they will remove wood. They will take and chip it away. Well, we don't have to do that with leather. We actually just compress the fibers of it, of the leather. We use these tools with the leather at the right moisture content. We just compress the fibers, and that, again, that's where we get that rich burnish. But so when doing this, I think probably, well, there's two things that are challenges for somebody first getting started. Number one is, again, getting this to come out nice and smooth. Once again, I'll remind you, you're watching somebody that's done leatherwork for over 50 years. So this should look like, wow, nothing to it. You just walk that tool along, and it pushes down the leather. There's nothing to it. You know what happened the first time I tried this? It looked like somebody took a ball-peen hammer to my leather. It was all chewed up. You could see every mark, everything that I did. I tried to move it like that, and you could see every little ding that I put into the leather. And those little dings are caused by, again, not using the correct technique. So what's the correct technique with this tool? And that is, again, it comes down to the grip. Just like with the pear shader, I've got that same tight grip. I've got it holding it pretty much with the same fingers and so forth. I have it so it's just lightly touching the leather, and as I tap it, it kind of bounces back up. And here's the thing I would have you look at, and I'm not doing this in slow motion. I'm doing this on purpose like this. But you see how far I move this tool each time I hit it? It's overlapping just a huge amount, probably 4/5 of that. So what you see when you hear me and see me using this tool and I'm going like this, that's what I'm doing. I'm only moving it a little bit each time, and that's how you get that to come out nice and smooth. You do that by overlapping these impressions quite a bit, and you'll develop this tapping and moving rhythm. This is something that comes with practice, obviously. Getting it to come out smooth the first time. I would encourage you to go at whatever speed you need to learn how to get it to come out smooth initially. But you'll find as you do more leatherwork, pretty soon you're just moving it right along, and you're able to develop speed. And that's where you get faster at your leatherwork. You don't get faster by trying to go fast. You get faster by learning how to do the techniques correctly. And then you don't have to go back and clean it up. You know, if it does come out choppy or bumpy, or you're not getting the results that you want, then yeah, go back and clean it up. Run over it again and get that those bumps to get smoothed out. But when you're beveling, for the most part, you want to hold this tool straight up and down. Now, sometimes we'll get into some of the finer designs, finer patterns where we have lines that run very close to each other, and so maybe you'll have to lean it forward just a little bit so that you don't flatten out so much leather behind it. You can do that and adjust actually how steep of an angle your beveler is. But for the most part, you want to hold the tool straight up and down. It's called a beveler because it's supposed to look like the leather is beveled away from the line that you're working on. You want it to, it gives you depth, and so that's how you use it. Don't tip it to the side. I've seen this happen more than once. Is somebody will think that the secret to walking this tool along is instead of letting it bounce along like that, they'll tip it like this and kind of drive it, you know. Well, when you do that, you're going to be scooting your whole piece of leather, but you're also going to be leaving the corner of the tool, leaving a mark in the leather each time you whack it. So again, learn this bouncing technique, this walking technique. This is so critical to learning how to use this tool and the pear shader correctly. The next question: how deep should I be beveling? How hard am I hitting this tool? What's the goal here on that? And that's a pretty easy one to answer. When you first cut this design into the leather, you were cutting it, if you'll remember, should have been cutting it about 1/3 to maybe 1/2 the thickness of your leather. However deep you cut that design into the leather, that's how deep you should be beveling. So when you get done with running the beveler along here, if you look at that cut, if you still see that there's a cut still existing at the bottom, then you didn't get to the bottom of the cut. If you are beveling deeper than what you cut, you're going to find that you're kind of rolling over the edges. You won't have sharp, crisp edges there. And sometimes that's done on purpose just to give a nice rounded effect to your carving. But the goal, as far as how deep should you be beveling, is that you bevel as deeply as you cut. And so what does that mean? There's another kind of important thing. When I was cutting, for example, the acanthus leaf, I had this outside edge of this acanthus leaf, I had it fairly deep out here, and as I come around the top of that leaf and came down to where that leaf kind of ended, where it kind of looks like it overlays onto the body of that leaf, I lightened up on that cut. That cut just kind of faded out to nothing. It didn't, when I cut it in, I didn't cut it as deep all the way to the very end of that cut. I got lighter and lighter and lighter starting about there, and it faded out. And so, you know what? I'm beveling to the bottom of the cut. So I'm getting lighter and lighter and lighter, and that cut just fades out just like that. So my beveling comes to a graceful end just like my cuts came to a graceful end. And this will really give you a nice flow to your design. It'll help, it'll make it look like everything is flowing nice and smooth. When you're beveling, make sure you're beveling right on the line. Just getting close to the line that you cut is not good enough. And while that might seem obvious to some of you, believe it or not, sometimes people just take a swing at it. And I'm working here in front of a camera right now, so obviously I've got lots of good light in front of me. But even if I did not have camera lights on me right now, I would have good lights here, because you know what? I'm not good at guessing what these tools do. I gotta see what they do, and that means I gotta have good lights here. And when I'm working, I don't wear glasses normally, but I do put on some reading glasses when I'm doing this stamping like this, because I want to be able to see what I'm doing. So I get some help with those kind of glasses so I can see what I'm doing. And the point of that being, you got to be able to see what you're doing. If you can't see what you're doing, it's going to be really hard for you to get the results that you want with this. So the beveling tool that I am using right now is just an average size tool, and it's probably about what anybody would have for their first beveler. But what I would tell you is that it's got a checkered texture on it. And again, I want to emphasize again, the rich burnish you see coming as a result of using this tool is not being caused by the texture on the tool. It's being caused by having just the right amount of moisture in the leather. And so again, I'm always checking to see if I'm getting that good color. If I am, that means I've got just the right amount of moisture. If that for some reason starts to not show up, then I'm going to have to check my moisture again and dampen it one more time. The challenge when someone is first getting started doing leather work is figuring out which side of these lines need to be beveled on. And like I said, while every line has to be beveled on one side or the other, the challenge is which is the right side. So, for example, on this design here, I started out with the flower on purpose. First of all, the flower is the focal point of this design. It's the most major part of it, but everything else kind of comes out from underneath it. In fact, if you look at this flower, there are petals that lay one on top of the other. When I started beveling, I beveled kind of these petals here because they're the ones that are kind of facing towards you, and then I beveled around the bottom of that flower, and I beveled all the way around this petal because this petal is laying on top of that one, so I beveled that one next, and then I did this one on the other side. I beveled all the way around that, and then I beveled this one in background first. Why did I do it in that order? A general rule for leatherworkers is that we bevel, or we carve our design working from the foreground into the background. And while that may not make a lot of sense to you right now at this stage of your leatherworking, that's something I just have you put in the back of your mind. When you are sitting there working on a project and you don't have a video of me telling you do this next and so forth, you got to figure this stuff out. You got to figure out where do I bevel? What side of the line do I bevel on? How do I do this? And so you got to kind of know what it is you're making. If you've got a flower, how are you going to make that stand out? If you got leaves, does one leaf lay on top of the other? And if they do, how do you accomplish that? What do you push down to give it that effect? So it takes some thinking a little bit. Technique is part of it, yes, but it's more than just having the right technique. It's also making sure you use these tools in the correct order and in the correct place. The beveler, like I said, that I'm using is a checkered beveler, and I will tell you there's a reason I like to use a checkered beveler or tools that have some kind of texture to them. And that has a lot to do with the way I like to finish things. We have different finishes and such sometimes that will collect some additional color down in those textures and make them stand out. And that's not what this class is about, but I wanted you to know why I use the tools that I have, or the textures that I'm using, because it wasn't just what I happened to grab, it's just kind of what my favorites are. All right, this leather, this last little bit of beveling I did there, it's not giving me quite as dark a burnish as I'd like, so I'm going to dampen it again. But I want you to pay attention to this, and this point is that I'm not going to wet it nearly as much as I did the first time. When we wet it the first time, remember, we wet it so that the moisture got penetrated down like halfway through that piece of leather. Well, that moisture's still down in there, but it has dried here on the surface of the leather. So I'm just going to lightly moisten it on top so that I have some moisture there. But I don't need to re-soak it, the way I initially did. So, I usually let it just start to dry back just a little bit. But because I didn't put that much water on it, it's kind of ready to go again already here. So we'll keep right on beveling. I mentioned to you that the tools need to be held for the most part straight up and down. One of the things you don't want to do is get into the habit of leaning it backwards. I'll go ahead and exaggerate that here, but sometimes people will lean it back when they're beveling. And what happens when you do that, you have the back end of the tool here leaving a line that kind of is like a mirror of the shadow of your design. You want to hold this tool straight up and down so that you don't get that mirror. You don't want to get that line showing up there because well, it detracts from the design. You want your beveling to kind of basically fade out to nothing, just like when we did the pear shading and such. You want it to kind of gradually fade away there. And that tool will do that if you hold it straight up and down when you're beveling. And again, as I mentioned, the beveling's going to take you longer than any of the other steps, and it may seem like, oh my goodness, there is so much beveling that needs to be done, but just stay at it. Do remember that this is the most important of your stamping steps. This is the one that gives your design that three-dimensional look. It's the step that makes your design stand out on this piece of leather. So it's not the one you want to hurry through. This is the one you want to be very tedious, very deliberate. You want to make sure that you get your all of your lines beveled, get them beveled correctly, get them beveled deep enough, because that's how we make it stand out. And if what has inspired you to give leatherwork a try is that you maybe saw a picture of a horse or some kind of an animal that somebody did in leather, and you want to be able to do that kind of work on leather, well, guess what? You better know how to bevel, because most of that kind of leather work is done with beveling tools. It's mostly beveling that you use when you're doing figure carving. And you know what? If you know how to use this tool right here, or whatever beveler you have in your kit right now, that tool is going to be used the same way when you're doing figure carving, or when you're doing really small floral, or whatever kind of style of work, Celtic carvings, it doesn't matter. A beveler is a beveler, and they're all used the same, and it doesn't matter which one of the ones that you happen to have or what the texture is. Again, the important thing, and that's what I'm showing you here, is the technique. We did a video, and I mentioned videos on our website, but I did a video just on beveling, and I think it was like 2 hours long. And it's not that I'm a really slow beveler, it's just that there's so many different things that are so important about the beveler. Not just the technique, but then also what are all these different textures used for, and so forth. So if you really want to get into the details of what a beveler is, and how to use one correctly, and how to, even which ones to use for different purposes, that's kind of what that video was all about. So, and you'd be surprised. There are folks that have been doing leatherwork a long time that struggle with this tool. They don't want to admit it, because but it is a troublesome tool for many leatherworkers, and has been over the years. You see how my rich color, the burnish is starting to come back. You can see that I've got, with just a little bit more moisture, I'm getting a little darker color out of it. That's what I was, I guess the point I wanted to make about letting your tools tell you when you need to add more moisture to your leather. When you're not getting that burnish, it's a moisture issue. It's not your tools or anything else. So we have here a turn back on this acanthus leaf, which is kind of like where the tip of the leaf is folded back on itself, and so we got to bevel around it like this, so it looks like this vein runs up underneath it. But this vein gets beveled too. Sometimes people will kind of overlook this, or skip over this particular part, but when we use the camouflage tool, and this is one of the reasons we use these tools in the sequence we do, I did as careful a job as I could to make sure I didn't let the impression of the camouflage tool reach across the line, but it did in a couple places. But since this line now gets beveled, I can come back, and when I bevel it, I clean that up. Now it looks like I've got really a neat texture running right out of that cut, and that's one of the reasons that we do the camouflage first, and so forth. It helps us to just make all of these steps flow together a little bit better. One final thing that I would point out as I near the end of this beveling is there will be places, in fact I'm working on one right now, where we've got this little bud that kind of comes up in between these two stems, and if you the square tool doesn't actually do the best job of beveling. A beveler's got a square face on it, and what you've got here is a little pointed shape that's in here, and if you try to bevel down into the very corner of that shape, you're going to flatten out way more than you want to. And don't worry about it. This is an area that we're going to be backgrounding it down. Your background tool that we use comes to a very fine point, so let's not try to make a square tool do what a pointed tool should be doing. So let's not worry about that. But before we move on, let's take a quick look at it and see what we've done. We've got all of these lines beveled. We beveled as deeply as the lines were cut. We kind of made sure we were beveled on the correct side of every one of these lines, and like I said, that's something that becomes easier to recognize the more leather work you do. But once we've got it all beveled, we're actually going to be very close to finishing up. The beveler, like I said, takes probably more time than any of the other steps, but the next thing that we're going to do is we're going to put some seeds in the middle of this flower. And this is a pretty simple thing. The seed tool is nothing more than that. It's a little round dot, and it's for putting seeds in the flower. But there's a little trick to this, or at least there's a trick I like to use anyway. And first of all, remember we got a dotted line there. That was kind of our guide as to where these seeds go. And so when I begin, I start by putting a row of seeds right on that dotted line. And here's the thing I would have you take special note of, and that is, you notice the angle I have this tool? I have it kind of tilted away so that it makes a much deeper impression on the outside edge than it does on the other side. So it's kind of an angled impression. And what that does is it kind of makes it look like those seeds are standing out just a little bit. It almost makes it look like I beveled around each one, and it helps to give a little more 3-dimension. What we want to accomplish when we put the seeds in the center of the flowers, we don't want to mat this leather down so it looks like this is a sunken hole in the middle of that flower. We want these to look like they're standing out, like they're kind of raised up. So as I now then add more seeds to this, and I'm going to fill this whole area in with this seed texture, that's all I'm doing. I'm just adding the texture of the tool. I'm not, you can probably hear that the force of the blows just got really light. I used quite a bit of force on that outside edge because I wanted to really drive that outside corner down. But now as I fill this in with row after row of seeds, working from the outside toward the center, I'm just lightly tapping it. I want to just add the texture of that tool. If I was to really hammer these down, they would, look like they were sitting in a hole, and we would lose a lot of that 3-dimension that we're trying to accomplish here. So what you should be striving to do is to make each one of these seed impressions touch the other right on the side, but not cut one in half. You don't want one seed impression cutting the one beside it in half. So and that's really all that the seed tool does. It just fills in that area on the flower where the seeds would be growing. Then we have another tool that we use to add some more texture to the design, and that's called a veiner tool. And once again, its name kind of tells you what it does. It puts veins in the leaves. That's kind of what it does. In fact, one of the places, remember this acanthus leaf that we did? The one with the curving line? We ran the camouflage tool on one side of it, and then we beveled just opposite that. Well, I'm going to now use the veiner tool along that same line on the side that I beveled, just opposite of the camouflage. But again, because this is such a long tool, I have to angle it quite a bit so it only reaches to the edge of this leaf. I don't want to be, reaching all the way across and taking a ding out of a leaf right next to it. And once again, the angle of this tool and the length of this tool is really important. Having the spacing just nice and even like you see here, but having them starting to rotate and have the angle change just a little bit with each one, it kind of makes it look like all of these these impressions all kind of run down into the center of that leaf. You see how we've got the camouflage on one side and we got the veiner on the other, and it looks like everything's just kind of folding into that crease in the center. And what gives that effect is the angle. Sometimes I'll see folks using this Vayner tool and they'll run it like perfectly sideways coming up here. Well, that just ruins that whole flow. You see the angle of that? I have a bit of an angle between each one of these. That's what gives you that effect of having curvature to the leaf. One of the other places that we'll use this tool is we'll use it around the outside edge of this scroll. And here's a little trick on that. I'm going to start right down here, like where this leaf here kind of ends, and I'm going to run it all the way around the outside. But again, the angle of this tool, all of this is really important to get the effect that we are after. So what I do is I pick a spot. My tool is kind of long, and what I will do is when I start here on this corner, I'm going to imagine that this other corner was pointed exactly toward the middle of this scroll in its tightest spot where it's kind of almost a circle there. I'm going to, and then as I work around here, I'm going to, again, imagine that corner's every time is pointed right at that, at the center of that scroll. But I'm going to have it angled such that it fades out when it only gets about a third of the way across. I ran a pear shader tool around the inside of that scroll. And so as my Vayner reaches the edge of that pear shading, it kind of fades out. So it only goes just a little ways across the scroll, but the angle of the tool, I'm still moving this tool so that it's angled in such a way that it looks like if they were long enough, they would eventually come together and connect right in the middle of that scroll. And what that does is it gives me a nice kind of a spiral look to this. It really helps to, again, create some flow to this part of the design, and it helps to give this kind of a rounded edge. It looks like it's kind of a rounded edge. Looks like all of these impressions just kind of roll over the edge of that scroll. As we come around the tighter part of this curve, obviously we have to change that angle a little bit more between each impression. And you can see I've got this tool or my piece of leather turned so that I can see exactly where it goes. I can see how far it was between the last impression, and make sure that I keep nice consistent spacing. And again, that's what gives this part of your design a nice look, is having consistency in the spacing. You'll also notice that my Vayner impressions got a lot lighter as I come around here. They got shorter as I got toward the tip, but that's kind of where the Vayner impression gets used. They make some tools, they're called stop tools, and they're usually not part of a beginner set of tools, but you know, I didn't have one either when I got started. But I learned that if you take the very corner of this Vayner tool and tip it up real sharply, you can use it in the junction of like these flower petals like that, and it gives you almost the same kind of an impression. So I'll often use that tool to do that as well. And then one more thing, we've got over here a bud that kind of sticks up in between this stem and this leaf on the side, and that needs a little bit of texture. I don't like to leave that one plain, so I'm going to again use some Vayner impressions. I'm going to kind of like run up each side of it using a bit of an angle to it, but I have those impressions fading out as it reaches to about the middle of that little bud. And then I'll do some on the opposite side that kind of look like they all come together right there in the middle. And it just gives me a nice texture to that. So anyway, that's what the Vayner tool does. It starts to add, it gives us veins in this leaf here, and it gives us kind of a veined effect around the outside of the scroll. That's its purpose. And you know what? We're down to the very last of the stamping tools. We've gone through all of the basic stamping steps. There's one more thing that we do, and this one really does make your design stand out. It's called the background tool, and it's kind of a little diamond-shaped tool, elongated diamond. It comes to a point on one end. It's got a checkered texture, and this is actually probably the tool that came with my beginner's kit. I've had this one forever and ever, and you know what? I think it's still the one most people start out with it, and if it's not, it's the one you should. It's the easiest of all of the background types of tools to use. And what it does is it takes and it mats down the leather in these openings. When you know, we got leaves and petals and flowers and stuff like that. But then in between, we got these gaps where you can kind of see all the way through the design and everything. And if we use this tool in those areas there, we put a checkered and matted texture in there, and that tends to give us even more three-dimension in our design, and that's what this tool is all about. There's a few things that will help you make this tool work easier and give you good results, and one of those is to make sure you get it deep enough. How deep should you be backgrounding these areas down? How hard should you be matting with this tool? And again, the rule I tend to follow on that is I want to background these areas down as deeply as I cut those lines, or as deeply as I beveled those lines. So, you know, I could have this design standing out 1/3 the thickness of my leather if I do that. So, and just to make sure that I get the right amount of depth in there, one of the things I'll usually do when I have a larger background area like this to cover with this tool, I'll kind of go around the outside. I'll go around the design, or around that background area, right up against the leaf, or right up against the edge of that area with my background tool, making sure that I get as much depth there as I need. And that also then makes sure that I'm being really careful now that I don't take a bite out of the edge of one of my leaves or something like that. That's kind of a hard thing at this stage. But then I will come back and fill this in. I'll come back now and mat all of this leather in between down to that same depth. And you'll actually develop kind of a walking rhythm with this one as well. The trick to getting it to come out nice and smooth is to overlap the impressions quite a bit, and you'll want to get this to come out fairly even without having to run over it too many times. If it looks a little lumpy, or if it's not all the same depth initially, you can go back over it and even it out, but try to do that without having to go over it too many times. The other thing that helps to make your backgrounding come out, this is the last of the stamping steps, okay? So theoretically, your leather's going to be about as dry as drier than some of the other steps. And I've found that having your leather a little bit drier when you're doing the backgrounding does tend to help with making these come out nice and even. Sometimes if this is too wet, you lose the distinction, you lose that crisp matted texture when you're doing that. So you want to make sure that you don't have it too wet when you're doing this, and you'll end up with a lot more even and consistent backgrounding texture. So make sure you know what you're backgrounding down. You don't want to like be backgrounding a leaf or something like that down. So again, study your pattern, or make sure you know what you're doing. But you can see it's burnishing too. I'm getting some really nice color where that's being done. I'm getting some really good contrast, and that's, again, as I was saying earlier, this is one of the great things about using, learning how to get use the right moisture content to get that natural burnish to come out of your leather. If you're able to do that, you really don't need dyes and antiques and finishes and like that to give additional 3D to your design. It will develop just a beautiful patina all of its own, and it's just the natural color of that leather. So pay attention to that, even all the way through. We got, we're getting very close at this stage to finishing this up, and sometimes it can be tempting to hurry at this stage. And now that we've put some effort into carving this design, this would be just the last time to hurry. You don't want to, at this point, like I said, have a stray impression that takes a bite out of one of these leaves or whatever. Make sure that you are, doing your best work even at the end here, that just as you were all the way through it. This is the basics of leather carving. What I've been showing you here is all of the things that someone, the stuff I wish somebody had showed me in this kind of detail when I was starting. I mentioned that I got to do a lot of trial and error when I was getting started, and while trial and error does teach you some lessons, they can be expensive lessons. So, you know, if you can pick up a few tips and hints from what I'm showing you here, hopefully it'll speed you along to that point where you're doing some leather work that you're really proud of. And remember when I was talking about that little place that the beveler just didn't seem to want to fit in there? This is the tool. The shape of this tool is made for defining like those small points like that. So that's the last spot here. I've got the background, and so I'm going to very carefully make sure I bring out that little point, that little bit of a bud that's in between these two stems here. And that tool does exactly what I wanted done. So you see how that background tool kind of, it divides up the design. It helps you to see all of the different elements of the design standing out. Oh, there's another spot here. We better get this one. But it really adds another level of 3-dimension to your carving when you do this background step. And that really is all of the places that normally we would background. One of the things I'll do, and I'll just show you this a little extra tip here. Sometimes when I have a design that doesn't have a border or something like that around it, and I want to get a little more 3-dimension, I'll go ahead and back into some of these little background into some of these little places like this. But then, since I don't have a crisp edge on the other side of it, I'll fade out that backgrounding as I work out and away from that. So you don't actually see where my backgrounding ended, but you can see, you know, I get some real contrast and some real additional depth way in tight in those little tight corners and such like that. So it's just another way to get some additional 3-dimension out of a carving like this here. So sometimes learning how to feather out your tools, that's kind of what that's called, feathering out your backgrounding, just kind of like we did with the beveler when we were doing that, and with the pear shader when we were using it. We feathered them out, got a little lighter as we went. This does basically the same thing. So anyway, but that's, and I could do a little bit more there, but that's the basics. Now that we're all done with all of the stamping steps, there really is only one thing left to do, and that's a step called the decorative cuts or ornamental cuts. And if you look at a floral carving, a Western carving, quite often in all of these flowers like this and leaves even, they'll have some swivel knife cuts that are running in the midst of these leaves, and that's what comes next. So before I do that, though, I need to have a little more moisture. It needs to be a little bit, have a little bit more casing done to it before we actually do that step. So I'm going to come back and wet it one more time. And again, this is just that light coat of moisture on the surface of the leather. I'm not soaking it all the way through or anything like that. And then I'm going to let that dry just a little bit before I tackle it with my swivel knife. As our leather is starting to dry back to its original color here, I am going to, before I start cutting, I'm going to strop my knife again. This is one of the things that I would encourage you to make a habit early on. Every time you pick up this tool, you should strop it. That way you will never have a knife in your hands that's not ready to do the job you need it to do. So strop your knife a few times. And something else I'll point out about this stropping. I've done this a few times, as you know, over many years, but when I'm stropping, I'm pretty deliberate about making sure I keep the bevel of that blade flat on the surface of my strop as I bring it back, and I try to do equal number on both sides. I have seen folks kind of actually dull their blade by bringing their knife back and then rolling their hand up like this. So if you get into a habit of doing this, you're actually going to make your knife duller. So when you're doing this, you want to make sure that you're stropping it with straight strokes that come back and then pick it straight up. So anyway, it should be ready to go. So what are decorative cuts? Like I mentioned, they're cuts that fill in these designs, but there's nothing here to follow. I have no lines. I have nothing to guide me. So at this point, it's kind of up to me what I put in there. So let me explain what decorative cuts are and what's the purpose. Even though we've got some contour and some shape and texture in here, they still would look pretty plain if we left them like that. So decorative cuts are a way of dressing up these flower petals, and they need to follow the flow of the design. Remember, as we were doing the pear shading and such, we made sure that it was heavy out here and it all faded out and tapered toward the center of the flower. And even on these leaves out here, all of it kind of faded out as it went down the length and the flow of the stem work and so forth. Well, that's kind of what we want the decorative cuts to do as well. When I do the decorative cuts, I'm going to start out at the top. I'm going to have some heavy pressure there, but as I pull the knife toward me, I'm going to lighten up and fade it out, and you'll never see actually where I ended it. In fact, it looks like these cuts, in fact, when I do these, I'll do them in a group, but it looks like all of these cuts, if they were to go far enough toward the center of this flower, they would all eventually run together. But I lighten up on that pressure so that it fades out and disappears before they actually ever run one cut into another. So usually when we do this, we'll do them in a series like this, a group of cuts. And again, the goal here is to make them follow the flow of the design. We don't want to have these running in a direction that's contrary to the way the flower petals lay. So but how these actually get done, that's going to end up being a choice you get to make with every design you do. Usually if there's something like this, and you'll have this one to look at if you download this free pattern, but you'll have this to look at so you can get an idea of how I do it. But you'll find as you do your decorative cuts, you'll find that there's some that you can do better than others. And you will probably be able to just kind of do your own. But when you're first starting out, just learning how to make them add to your design and not detract from it is the key. Really important is this tapering out. When I put this cut, the blade into the leather, I actually start out with a pretty good amount of pressure. I'm cutting and making that cut open up nice and wide, but then as I move toward where that's going to fade out, I start lightening up on that pressure so that the last probably 1/3 of the length of that cut, it keeps getting lighter and lighter and lighter until it fades out to nothing. And that's the secret to making them have a nice flow and to make sure that they add to your design. And they take practice. When you're first starting out, you probably cannot do enough cutting with this knife. And by that I mean if this were just a practice piece, you got all this blank leather around here. If you've not been using that blank leather to try out all of your different tools and learn how hard to hit them and learn how to run your swivel knife and such, all of that, that's what you should be doing. The only way you ever get good doing any of this, it doesn't depend on how clever my video here might be. You have to learn how to do it yourself. You have to actually make these tools work for you, and that takes practice. You'll never get that unless you just sit down and do some leather work. And if there's nothing else you get from this video, it is that if you want to get good at this, it'll practice. Now hopefully it won't take you 50 years. Hopefully I've showed you a few things that I learned over those 50 years that have made this work easier and better for me. And like I said, I wish when I was getting started I'd have had somebody that would have sat down and said, okay, here's the things that you need to know. Here's the right way to handle the tools. Here's the way to hold the knife. Here, when I was first starting, I grew up on a ranch and I was like 50 miles from the nearest town. We would go there, once a month or something like that, and that's kind of where I fell in love with leatherworking. I saw these saddle makers, plying their trade. And when I got started at it, I had my swivel knife. I had a good swivel knife. There's nothing wrong with that. I sharpened the heck out of it, and I was trying as hard as I could, but boy, I could not make it glide through the leather. It just was sticking and jumping and dragging along, and I just didn't know what I was doing. And so one day I was at that saddle shop. We were stopped by to get something repaired or whatever, and I saw this old saddle maker reach down and grab a strop of leather, and he took his knife and he stropped it on leather. He rubbed it on there a couple times and then went back to cutting with the swivel knife. And I said, "What's that about?" And he said, "Well, son, you got to learn how to strop your knife. It ain't gonna work right if you don't strop it." And I said, "Well, what is that?" And he gave me a little piece of jeweler's and he said, "You take this and you rub it onto a piece of leather or something, and then you run your knife over that. You strop it every once in a while when it starts to drag like that, and it'll work a lot better." Well, goodness gracious, I couldn't believe the difference that made. Well, I just wish somebody had told me that early on. You know, I wish when I was first starting out, when I was getting inspired and going to give my leatherwork the first try, I wish somebody had been there to say, "Okay, here's the important things. Number one, you got to have your knife working good. Got to be stropped up, and it's got to be working well." I wish somebody had told me that. Sure would have saved me some frustration. I'd have found this a lot easier tool to use. The other thing, you know, as you're doing your decorative cuts, is that let that swivel put those graceful turns into your cuts. If you're, you know, should not be wrestling that knife around the corners by shifting your whole arm or your wrist or whatever to try to make it give you those nice curving cuts. It's all done with letting the swivel do its job. So. And again, you can see, and I guess the point I hope you get is that it does not take a lot of tools. It does not take a huge investment to get into leatherworking. I mean, you can get, there's several companies that sell basic sets of tools. You know, the stuff that you see me using, you can buy those usually grouped in a set pretty reasonably. And that's really all you need to get started. As you do more leatherwork, yeah, you'll probably find some things you want to add to that. I've over the years gathered up a lot of tools, but it's not that I need. In fact, people that look at the work that I do, they probably be surprised when they find out that I usually grab the same handful of tools almost all the time to do a lot of the work that I do. These same tools you see me using today, it doesn't take anything different than that. These right here are the important basics of leatherworking. And of all of the classes that I've ever taught, learning these things right here is the most important thing that you could ever learn. Learning how to use these tools right. Learning how to get these basic techniques ironed out early on so that you don't have bad habits that you have to break later makes such a difference in your satisfaction that you're going to get out of leatherworking. One of the things you'll want to do as you approach to what you think is the end of your project here is to stop and look it over. Is there a leaf you missed some cuts on? Is there a background area you missed? Is there, double check it, because you want to make sure you get it completed. And with all of this, take whatever time it takes to do your best work. Learn how to use these tools smoothly. You don't see me trying to do these cuts at a fast pace. I'm doing each one of these very slow and very deliberate, making sure that it does exactly the cut that I want. And that's what you need to do. You need to work through it very deliberately and take your time with it. So, well, there you go. That right there is the basics of leatherwork. That right there, if you could do that with those 6 basic tools and that swivel knife, these tools right here, if you could use these tools and this swivel knife, I mean, you can carve saddles, you can do gun scabbards, briefcases, wallets, belts, whatever. You're not limited by the amount of leatherwork you can do by the number of tools you have. What does limit you is how much you know about how to use these tools. The techniques in making them do the job they were designed to do. So The last thing I would tell you, if you want to get good at this, you got to practice. Practice, practice, practice. But I hope you have as much fun with it as I've had. The final step with any project, once you've got it completed, once it's completely carved, we usually will put some kind of a protective finish on it. And that's to make it somewhat water resistant. There's a lot of things that are available, acrylics and so forth, that will do that. And so that would be the next thing to do with this. But before you do that, you always want to make sure your leather is completely dry, so that you don't have any residual moisture still in it. But let me show you. Here's one that I did recently. This same pattern, and this one has had a finish put on it. This has basically what we call an antique type of finish, which it's an acrylic finish. It did protect it and gave it a little bit of a gloss. You can probably see that, but it also helped to highlight the work that I did, and it settled in and gave the pear shading a bit darker shadows. It gave the decorative cuts, made them a little more prominent. It settled into the background areas and gave them a little more contrast. So these are some of the things that you can do to add even more dimension to your leather. But it doesn't have to have color to it, but it should have some kind of protective finish on when you're done. So that'd be the last thing that you would do to a project like this. So anyway, I hope you have a lot of fun with your leatherwork.